Hello there, Evie here. Welcome to a full and thorough review of the Cooler Master Masterbox Q300L. This video is exceptionally long for a standard case review. Unfortunately, in some circumstances when I review cases, I deem some cases generally run longer than the 20-minute target because there are certain bits of the case, or lots of bits of the cases, that are interesting, confusing, and just generally need more explanation. This case has plenty of that going on, good and bad, so there are little segments that need special bits of attention to cover certain bits. As a few disclaimers of what's coming up, anything that I do that is outside of the realms of the instructions in the instruction manual from Cooler Master themselves, or any of the components I use here, is not covered by Cooler Master or any of the components here. So if you want to specifically use certain components, very specifically follow instructions from the manufacturers of those components, and that you won't steer yourself far wrong from avoiding any warranties and things like that. As for a basic overview of what we're covering, if you want to skip to certain parts of the video, even when you're further into the video looking at certain parts, then look in the video description. There are timestamps all over looking at when I'm looking into certain components to install, or what bits I'm looking at into overviews or more specifics, so go to the links in the video description. That'll jump you straight forward. Unfortunately, annotations are not a thing on YouTube, so I can't just put a pile of them down here that you can click on. So anyway, moving on from that then, if you want to support the video or the channel in any way, look towards the end of the video. And if you want to know my absolute full opinion of this case and all the little bits inside it, then look at the end of the video in the conclusion segment, and I will dish out all of the information that I've tracked when going through all of this case. So I take notes just so I don't miss anything at the end. So I'll catch you in a second to crack on with the unboxing, and yeah, hope you enjoy it. Since we're fully reviewing the Q300L, let's start out with the unboxing. The packaging consists of a brown cardboard box, two polystyrene bookends which seem a little slimmer than average, and a clear plastic bag, which is all familiar territory to a budget case. Removing all the packaging and taking a good first look at the case, this specific Q300L didn't seem to appreciate this packaging choice. It seems to have gotten off quite lightly in terms of damage, but it didn't get off scot-free. The front magnetic mesh sheet has spent at least a few weeks bunched up inside the box, which has created a sizable curve in the mesh. This isn't the end of the world, since it can be flattened out after a good few hours of compression, but I can imagine this isn't the only Q300L that's experienced this problem. So we're going to have to use the top mesh sheet to stand in for the front mesh where required, like this, until the front mesh sheet has been flattened out, of course. So let's take a quick tour around the case before getting into specifics. The front of the Q300L predominantly features a magnetic mesh sheet, which we've talked about enough for now, but to avoid complaints, both mesh sheets present the same geometric pattern, which I think looks great, but it may not work for you as well. The only other features to the front are a couple of full-width plastic strips that finish off the bezel to the top and bottom of the front and back of the chassis, the front top one holding the Cooler Master logo. The near side panel is a full cover plastic side panel window, although you could probably easily have a tempered glass sheet cut to fit, but I can imagine there will be a tempered glass edition round the corner released in the next year, like the Masterbox Lite 3.1. The only other feature here is the front I/O, which is within the side panel window and has a surprising amount of positions that it can occupy. The rear of the case is very typical of most cases, having the rear I/O position to the top left. The rear fan position is up to the top right, which currently houses an included 120mm 1000 RPM fan. Just below the fan and the I/O positions are the PCI Express slots, which are disappointingly occupied by snap-off covers, the hallmark, or as I see it, the tramp stamp of a budget case. And just below the slot covers, at the bottom of the case, we find an ATX power supply unit position. I think the base of the case is the best place for a power supply unit, especially in lightweight budget cases like this, since it can be used to weigh down the system and keep it upright. The offside side panel is a solid steel panel with limited detailing. Saying that, the only detailing is a small lip to the top to help with panel removal, and there are also 4 rubber feet that can be used as easy grip screws to retain the side panel, but you can also tip the case onto its side for a horizontal layout. So let's quickly head back to those mesh sheets and see what they're made of. With the mesh sheet on a white desk like this, it's very hard to make out the pattern in the center. That should be a strong indicator of what's to come when we light the system inside later. The mesh itself is completely plastic, just pointing that out in case anyone thought the whole sheet was magnetic. Of course that's not the case, the sheet is held onto the steel chassis by an inner perimeter of magnetic strips. Bear in mind that this is a budget case when I say this, but the magnetic strips don't come out of the factory aligned perfectly flush with the edge of the sheet. Either that or the mesh sheet isn't cut perfectly straight. As for the chassis underneath them, the front and top panels are perforated with this circular pattern. From a first glance this looks great for ventilation purposes, but bear in mind that over half of the front and top panels are still solid steel, and adding a mesh to this will reduce the free area even further. A helpful feature on both of these panels is the rectangular cutout towards the far side of the case. These are there to help with feeding cables to the back of the motherboard tray. Adding to the point hinted at earlier, if you're looking to light the system inside this case, I hope you really like the circular pattern you see here, since you'll be seeing a lot more of it. Since we can't remove the top or front panels from the case since they're part of the chassis, we'll go for the steel side panel. After removing the screws from the corners of the panel, it can be lifted out with ease, and it even has a mild mechanism to stop the panel from falling off during this process. You may have noticed how much longer it took to remove those screws than you'd normally expect. Well, that's because the screws are about a foot long. Likely down to compatibility with the thicker side panel window, more on that later. Speaking of the side panel window, removing that was just a disappointment. There has been little effort made to prevent the panel from falling onto your desk during its removal, and if a tempered glass version is going to be created, this should be sorted out. But I won't hold my breath after seeing the tempered glass version of the Masterbox Lite 3.1. Right, let's stride forth and search for greener pastures. The rear of the case features the only included 120mm 1000 RPM fan mentioned earlier, which is a 3-pin fan if you are wondering. And just below this are the PCI Express slot covers seen earlier and the power supply unit position, which features a middleman bracket. You may be asking, why is there a bracket to hold the power supply unit? Well, you'll be interested to know that it's there to avoid the sloped corner of the case clashing with the power supply unit zone. Keep this in mind if you see anything of this case that you feel could have had an extra bit of work or material to improve. Looking at the bottom of the case, it's nice to see some sizable rubber pads to support the power supply unit, and there is a 120mm fan position towards the front that's not mentioned in the included manual. Since it happened, it's worth mentioning that wherever the accessories bag was attached inside the case, it's not attached there anymore. I can imagine there were more than just a few returned cases due to delivery-based damages. The front of the chassis, as well as the top, has positions available for two 120mm or two 140mm fans. As for AIOs, there's potential for two 280mm radiators, but that would depend on the exact AIOs you are looking for, and there would probably be issues with fans clashing. The motherboard tray has plenty of positives you'd look for in a case. To the right are a couple of positions for 2.5-inch drives, a feature that's becoming increasingly more popular with case designs lately, and there are also a good few well-placed cable routing cutouts, and looking to the back of the case there are plenty of really wide cable management loops which are perfectly sized for Velcro straps, a feature I'd like to see on all future cases from Cooler Master. And then there's this hard disk drive panel to the lower right, which has its own pros and cons. We'll get into that a little later. Okay, so very quickly going over the front I/O section. Now you can remove it from the case from the two screws to the side and two on the front. Now this is an interesting panel, an interesting component. It's quite unique in the sense that I haven't seen many cases with this, maneuverable I/O, front I/O. Now I'll probably be mistaken, there's probably other cases that do similar things or exactly the same thing. I know the Thermaltake Core V21 had a rotatable front panel, and the bezels could be rotated so it's so you have a different curvature on each side and that front I/O follows it. That was pretty cool. But this one, you can have it here in the front sort of position, which is standard, so as it was. You can have it in the top, which I think is quite an interesting one. Then all the lettering and all the symbols are in the right orientation, pretty cool. You can have it, which is my personal favorite, on the bottom, which means that although the lettering and all the symbols are upside down, it actually means that you can drop the front or the side window into that groove, and then it holds it when you're unscrewing it and screwing it back in. So if you're going to be inside and outside of this case a lot, that's probably the best place to put it. And then you'll have to route these cables around the bottom towards the front or the back, however you want to do that. Probably the back would work quite well, potentially. Actually, I'm going to retract that statement immediately. That power supply unit bracket could be an absolute pain in the butt. So that's really cool, really interesting. One thing that's also very interesting is that you can do exactly the same thing around the other side. Let's go over that very quickly. So you can do the same in the front side situation here. So that will slot in, if I get the right mesh here. Where is it? There it is. So it slots in there, 2 screws there, 2 screws in the front, not a problem. You can do the same at the top. There are little cutouts, so you can see the little cutouts here at the top, which you can slot these little notches into, so you know where it's going to slot itself into position quite well. And you can do the same at the bottom. The question is, although not very nicely at the bottom, you'd have to sort the cabling out a little bit, but it looks like it does fit there. But the question is, why the hell would you want to? Why would you want this on this side of the panel? The only compatible side panel with this is the windowed side panel. Now, granted, if you don't want to have a windowed side panel, this is an option for you, but it's not an obvious option. It's not one that's really advertised, like, hey guys, you can flip the window around if you don't want to see it, and that's not a problem. It's not very advertised, so this would be a bit of a surprise to most people, I can imagine, unless you look into it quite a lot and you see a video like this and you go, that's a feature I like. But, I mean, regardless of that, okay, so you have the Windows side panel here. So you see all your cable management, which, granted, 90% of people's cable management is, you know, acceptable, but nothing nice to look at. So you're not going to be looking at a very spectacular system from the backside here. But also, the likelihood is that you're going to be having raised cables here. You're going to have like braided power supply cables going to the motherboard and going to the CPU, and they're going to be scuffing and rubbing against your nice windowed side panel. I mean, it's plastic, which means it's going to scuff it to hell. And once it's scuffed to hell, I mean, you're not bringing that back. So it's just going to be damaged, scratched, and all sorts. You're just going to see all your cable management here. You'll have to be really diligent with that. And then on the other side, you just have a steel panel and that's it. So yeah, like I say, the steel panel is not compatible with this component, so it's not like you can mix and match. I mean, maybe they should have thought of that. They should have had a breakout panel, a sort of blank panel which you can swap out for either one of them, and a blank panel to put in this place's position on the other side when you have a steel panel there. That would have made more sense. But this is just weird. And what's also weird is if you want to put a radiator at the front, like a 240mm radiator at the front, they say that you won't be able to put it in this position because it just won't fit. I personally can't see exactly why it won't fit, but just apparently it won't fit. I'm presuming maybe the cable management might be a little bit difficult. I don't see much of a clearance issue with the components, but, you know, I don't know. If you can put fans back there, you can put a radiator back there, in my opinion. So, yeah, I'm 50 shades of confused with this one, so yeah, I don't know. Black PCB, so fair enough, but whatever. Okay, let's just see if this gets any better. It's getting a little bit kooky at the moment. Before we get into the building of the system, and yes, I'm fully aware we're about 15 minutes into the video, let's take a quick look at the accessories bag. In the accessories bag, we find 2 sets of extended 2.5-inch drive screws, motherboard and power supply unit screws, 6 additional standoffs to the ones pre-installed in the motherboard tray, a crosshead to hex nut adapter, 10 zip ties, and grommets for the sets of extended 2.5-inch drive screws. There is also a manual for the case which is basic and incomplete at best, not explaining much of this case's broader capabilities. Anyway, let's get on to building a system. How does this case stack up in terms of buildability? The power supply unit is a great place to start building a system in this case. First, this inner bracket needs to be removed, which only takes the removal of 4 screws, and then it can be pulled free from the case. Keep track of the mounting orientation of the bracket as you attach the power supply unit to it with 4 screws from the accessories bag, and then it's ready to go back in. Something I really recommend to anyone looking to build a system for the first time is that you should do your best to connect as many cables, ideally all cables, to the power supply unit at this point, since it's so much easier to do when it's outside of the case. Once that's all been sorted out, the cables can be fed through the cutout in the motherboard tray to keep them out of sight, and the power supply unit itself can be rested on the large rubber pads at the base of the case. Notice the power supply unit is fan side up. Well, I was trying to speed build this system, so I didn't notice it until after replacing the 4 screws to fix it to the chassis. Fan side up doesn't bother me in most cases, and I think it's a legitimate strategy in many cases, but here we want as much airflow going to the graphics card as possible, so I flipped it over before moving on. As for the test system, I needed to shift the Noctua L9i CPU cooler and the RAM from the mini ATX to the micro ATX motherboard. The test system's main components such as the i7-6700K CPU, the L9i cooler, and the majority of the RAM as well as the GTX 1070 stay consistent across all test systems. But the motherboard always gets sized up to the largest compatible board size for the respective case, since we're here to properly test the case, and weaknesses in cases' designs can be found through a simple change in board size. But rest assured, all boards are set up as identically as possible, so we've locked the CPU to 1.2 volts and 4 GHz, but of course there are always operating fluctuations and tolerances to take into account. But this should be a decent way to compare many cases of many different sizes. So with the test system out of the way, all details of which can be found in the video description, we can prepare for its installation with the I/O shield and the rest of the standoffs. These were both simple installations, but I did encounter an issue trying to install one of the standoffs to the rear of the case. Since there's no cutout in the chassis, the screwdriver needed to be positioned at a slight angle, which made fixing the standoff flush against the motherboard tray a little tricky. This is a small complaint, but it was an issue and it did happen, so it is worth pointing out. As for dropping the main part of the system into the case, there were no problems found here. The pre-installed standoffs are actually standoff posts that hold the motherboard in position during installation, and 8 screws later, we were done. Heading to the back of the motherboard tray, let's check out that hard disk drive panel and install some drives. I've got a total of 3 2.5-inch drives to install, which should be a piece of cake for any case of this size. You can basically install these things anywhere. Starting with the SSDs, here we can install the extended 2.5-inch drive screws with their accompanying rubber grommets. There's not a huge amount more to say about this process since it's really straightforward, so let's move on to the 2.5-inch hard disk drive. I was intending to install it to the hard disk drive panel to the rear of the case. Hard disk drives aren't as sexy as your typical SSD, so they're generally better off being hidden away where possible. But this is where I stumbled into another basic issue. If you want to skip this, head forward to the time on the screen now. Okay, well as much as the opinion so far might be quite negative, this isn't an all-round bad case, but I am finding really simple things, or just really confusing things that could just easily be changed or reworked to make it less confusing or simpler. So one thing that I came across when I was installing the grommets for the SSDs, you may have noticed that one of them was loose going on, and that's because I completely destroyed the thread of that previously, and it's been an issue and it's just completely died now. So that you may have noticed that I counter screw before I screw in on a lot of occasions. That's so you don't do that, but on one occasion I just tried to rush it, and the one time I didn't do it, it destroyed the thread. So yeah, especially when you're working with steel screws in like an aluminium case, steel and aluminium, you really want to be careful about the aluminium. It's like spark plugs in an engine. Always counter screw and then screw in, because the steel will just destroy the thread of the engine block, and then what you're going to replace the I don't know what you call it. I'm not an engine person, but I just know that's a thing. So anyway, a big opportunity missed, and it's not really a big opportunity, but it's an opportunity that was so simple that it's such an obvious thing to just throw in, and you can up the spec of your system or the compatibility of your product. This panel for the hard disk drive at the back could have easily had some screws put in to put in a 2.5-inch drive. Now, I know it's rare that people have a lot of 2.5-inch drives. I actually have 4 of them lying around. I have 2 3.5-inch drives as well, but I only use 2.5-inch drives now because, you know, it's simple. And yes, these are all drives. That's a drive, that's a drive. Solid state drive, hard disk drive, they are all drives, or hard drives, all hardware. So anyway, what I'm going to be doing, because that wasn't put into place, and I can't really be bothered putting putting holes in there. I mean, I'm not going to do their job for them, because, you know, it's their job to design these things as best as they can, and they're clearly not doing an amazing job all round, but, you know, not too bad. Can't rip on them too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sacrifice a couple of the grommets from each of these. One of them's already done because it didn't fit in. And I'm going to put 4 of them. Actually, I'm probably just going to put 2 of them just because I want to hide this at the back. I don't want to see it. I'll put 2 of them on here, and this means then that I can have back-to-back with 2 on each in opposing corners on each side of the main panel, and that is going to give me the mounting capability on both sides. I think that's a really cool way of doing it. I think it'll work, although, you know, clearances to do with the screws might be a little bit off. I probably find it won't work now, but I'm going to give that a shot. If not, I might just put some screw holes into this, or just at least you can line up 2 of the screw positions here and then just put some sort of tape or something on it. I don't know, I'll work it out in a second. But yeah, a little disappointing, a lot of little things that's just, you know, really could have easily improved things. So yeah, with all the hype of this case, I've had this case around for a good month or so now, waiting to do the review because of a lot of other different things coming up, and I'm a little underwhelmed so far. So, you know, hopefully the rest of the system goes in nicely and I raise my opinion of it. But until then, see how it goes. So steaming forward with the plan for some back-to-back drive mounting action, we're positioning 2 screws on the 2 drives in opposing positions, although I managed to confuse myself at first, and then we're hopefully going to be able to mount them using the same 2.5-inch drive mounting hole cluster, if the screw clearances allow it. So the Kingston SSD goes in the front bottom position. This drive has 2 mounting screws and grommets. Above the Kingston drive is where the Samsung SSD with 4 screws and grommets is being positioned. You can see the mounting action is seamless, and I'd love to see this for every 2.5-inch drive in the future, and I hope Cooler Master continues to implement this system. And then with a little cajoling, the 2.5-inch hard disk drive was able to be positioned behind the lower SSD. Of course, all the obvious disclaimers should be mentioned, so if you do this, it's not supported by Cooler Master, the manufacturers of the drive, and it could void the warranty or cause damage to any of the components involved, anyone in the room during this procedure, including your dog. I think that's covered all the bases, so let's move on to cable management. I thought it would be a good idea to skip past the back and forth cable management process, but it has to be said I don't think this could have been made any easier. The sheer amount and size of the cable management loops allows the largest of Velcro straps to be used, and the huge almost 30mm depth behind the motherboard tray meant I could bundle and strap excess cables together without issue. And the positioning of the 2.5-inch drives with the previously mentioned points meant that I only needed to use one SATA power cable to provide power to all the drives. The only potentially messy part of this cable management was the SATA data cables that needed to make a short turnaround and had to be bundled up and strapped together to use up the excess. You may also notice the random power cable making its way up the side of the case and through to the other side of the motherboard tray. That's to power the LED strips later on. Normally it's an installation that is an afterthought, but it was all too easy to do in this case. This is such a clean and easy build so far thanks to that impeccable cable management space. So all that's left to do is install the graphics card. Can this build finish off on a home run swing? To find out, we needed to head round to the back to remove this single retention screw for this PCI Express slot cover screw cover. We'll just call it Dave from now on. Normally Daves like this are fixed with a hinge, but this Dave exists fixed into a couple of slits in the chassis, which I sort of prefer since it will hold Dave in position more securely. With Dave out of the picture, the PCI Express slot covers can be punched out. You can do this with a screwdriver like so, but honestly it's just easier to do it with your hands after the initial punch through. Thinking back to Dave, I don't think Dave needs to be completely removed to install the PCI Express card. I think with a slight redesign you could easily use the retention screw to form a more substantial slider mechanism than the one that's been created here, since with larger cards, having more space to maneuver is very helpful. Heading back to the back, my instinct was to fix the card to the chassis to relieve the motherboard of the card torquing on the slot as soon as possible, but it turns out that Dave needs to be put back into position first, and then the graphics card can be fixed to the chassis. This again makes me think that Dave isn't intended to be removed, or could at least have a larger slit cut out to negate the need to remove Dave, but the manual does state that Dave does need fully removing in order to install any PCI Express card. Okay, it doesn't exactly mention Dave per se, it doesn't actually mention many words, it's very sparse in general, but there is a picture showing it. And last but not least, for the system at least, the graphics card needs some power. Oh, and the fans need connecting to something, so we're going to connect 2 small fan hubs to the CPU fan header and one of the chassis fan headers for later when we add more fans. And I forgot about the front I/O, that's something you want to keep track of since it's something that's so easy to forget. Luckily, at the end of the build is the best time to install this panel. For all reasons mentioned earlier, I'm installing the front I/O at the bottom. It's a little tight since the power supply unit is right behind, but the cables can be bent into position and they slide right underneath the power supply unit's cables. As for fixing the front I/O into position, 2 screws need to go through the left and right of the panel, and then we can lay the case down onto its side to access the bottom. But before we cover the screws, we can't properly review this case if we don't take a considered look at the base. Scattered all around the base of the case are these rubber plugs which hold a full cover mesh filter to the base of the case. They are really easy to remove and replace, and if you really wanted to have your system in this position permanently, then you could remove the mesh entirely, as well as the 4 feet of the case which feature large rubber pads, and you could place one of the stylized mesh sheets here. However, Cooler Master don't appear to sell additional stylized mesh sheets, like the 2 we saw earlier for the front and the top. So you won't be able to get a third to make this case really stand out in this position. It'll unfortunately look half-baked if you catch a glimpse of the third unfinished side. Anyway, back to the 2 underside screws for the front I/O panel. They are really easily found at the bottom and have cutouts in the mesh filter for ease of access. Now all that's left to do is add the finishing touches, starting with the steel side panel which hooks quite nicely to the bottom of the chassis, and once we've added the 4 screws / horizontal feet, we can move on to the mesh filter sheets. I've had the misshapen mesh sandwiched between 4 panels of particle board for about half a day, and although they didn't completely flatten the sheet out, it did a good enough job when it came to replacing the panel. However, a very slight bulge in the centre of the mesh is still slightly noticeable. As for the top panel, there were no problems to be found here. It's worth reiterating, for all the negativity I've spoken about certain aspects of this case, stylistically I really like the geometric print on these panels that fade in and out, up and across the case. And as for the Windows side panel, now the front I/O is positioned at the bottom, it can now be slotted into position on this, and I can hands and hassle-free replace all the required screws to secure it into position. The way I see it, I don't see a better place for the front I/O to be positioned as standard, and I think this should be its default location out of the box. Now, something I generally leave towards the end of the video is the B-roll segment, but I think we need 2 shorter B-roll segments for reasons hinted at earlier. So please enjoy a short exterior look at the build, and I'll catch you in a minute as we run through some various tests. Just before we get into checking out the test results, to make it easier to digest, we'll be presenting both the As It Comes and Max Fans test results together. So the As It Comes test is just a test of the case with the fans that it comes with. So for this case, that's just the rear 1000 RPM 120mm fan, and the CPU and graphics card will just have to do their best to cool the system with that fan. This is a great value for money test in terms of performance. But the footage you're watching now is the conversion from the As It Comes test setup to the Max Fans test setup. This Max Fans test setup removes the 1000 RPM fan in the back and replaces that with a 2200 RPM 120mm EK F4120ER Varda fan. And we're throwing in another couple 2200 RPM 120mm fans in the front, as well as another to the top rear. I could also install bottom and top 120mm fans at the front, but from previous testing, all this does is disturb the existing more useful airflow created by the front fans, and in so many cases it reduces the thermal performance of an air-cooled system. One thing I found particularly annoying with the installation of the fans was the requirement to scrape away a lot of the inside material of the designated screw hole positions. I tried for minutes to get the screws into the designated holes before resorting to scraping away at them with a screwdriver. This isn't something you want to have to do when you've built a complete system in the case. So I know there's somebody going to be saying, well, for a start, the camera's wonky. Apologies for that. But there's guaranteed going to be somebody saying, oh, you should have put a fan at the top front, like the lords at Cooler Master, or the masters at Cooler Master tell you to do. I had this with the InWin 301 system when I set that up and showed it had poor thermals, and many other reviewers showed that it had poor thermals, but people were saying you should have set it up identically to the lords at InWin's specification and example, because they know everything about the case, they have tested it thoroughly. Everything that they know and tell you about the case is gospel, it is true, and you should listen to it. Well, let's take a little look at what Cooler Master would have you do to set up the system, not maybe optimally or for the best performance. You'll see this image on the screen now, rather than you having to decipher it from what I'm showing you on the screen here. So let's decipher this very quickly and pick apart why you do not listen to what they say and you listen to what lots of tech channels are saying, lots of third parties are saying about what you should do with these systems, and people who have tested the system. Right, so first things first, graphics card. Well, for a start, it's not propped up by the graphics card stand, which is fixed to the bottom of the case. It actually seems to just be very lightly touching the power supply cable for the graphics card, so completely useless feature there. It's actually inhibiting airflow through to the graphics card, which you will notice is on the bottom slot, which is likely to be a by 8 slot, PCI Express lane, so you're going to be wanting to use the by 16 slot, which is generally the top slot. Very rarely will you have two by 16 lanes on a motherboard, so you'd want to utilize the top slot. Regardless, if it is a by 16 lane, could be, then you're going to be wanting to have it on the top slot regardless, because it would also be a guaranteed by 16 lane, and it would give you better airflow than squeezing it on the towards the upper part of the power supply unit. So the power supply unit and the graphics card are potentially competing for around about 10mm of airflow headroom. We don't see a green arrow pointing up for the power supply unit, so we can only presume that it is having its intake from the interior of the case, which means it is definitely competing for air with that graphics card. So that is a very poor setup. We know from the CR280 test results, which was a mini ATX test case, that it's a very poor system setup to have the power supply unit and the graphics card so tightly together. You're basically inhibiting half of the airflow of the graphics card and the majority of the airflow of the power supply unit. But you'd go fan side down surely, but they haven't presented that. Moving up to the top there, we have a fan at the top front. It is not an AIO, it is just an LED fan. It's to the top front, not to the top rear, which would be arguably more useful, encouraging air across the motherboard, the RAM, and potentially a CPU cooler if you have an air cooler, and then exhausting it up through the top. Instead, they've gone for the top front, which means it is cooling, well, not the drive, which there is a drive position there at the top front, but they've got a front bottom drive mounted on the 2.5-inch drive, so really that fan is just cooling about quarter of your RAM stick at the front before the cool air is being immediately extracted as hot air, and that is also inhibiting airflow through to the AIO to the rear of the case. There is no AIO at the front. From this visual, you cannot see that there will be a conceivable thickness of radiator there, and plus you can't see any tubes routing to the graphics card, which is an air-cooled graphics card, or the CPU, which has got a rear AIO. So yes, I would say that do not listen to any of these companies that are presenting to you designs such as this. It is supposed to be Cooler Master, but clearly they are not being masterful in their use of marketing here, or presenting useful information to anyone. This is actually misleading to a consumer looking to buy this product. So listen to your tech reviewers, not necessarily myself, but there's so many tech channels around that are reviewing this case and many others and giving tips and advice and test data to back up what they say. So listen to those people, not this. This is just a marketing company who's had the technical specs handed over to them and say, right, have fun with this case. Frankly, I would have thought the marketing company or marketing part of their company would have had more knowledge in how to set up a successful and optimal cooling setup, being that they are Cooler Master. That is not Cooler Master style work. Although it technically is, so isn't that ironic? Anyway, let's move on. Let's get on to the actual test results. Let's quickly actually finish off the setup for the maximum cooling setup, and then we'll get into the test results. They are pretty meaty and interesting. So all that's technically left to do is to link all the fans to the 2 fan hubs to the rear of the motherboard tray, and then we're all good to seal the case back up and get into some thermal testing results. But just before I started thermal testing, I discovered something a little concerning. So just before we go into the full speed thermal testing, now I just found out something that is quite annoying, and it does pertain to the quality of this case. And yes, I probably mentioned quite a few times just then that having to just sort of drill out the screw holes, or the positions for the screw holes to install the fans, is pretty ridiculous, and that should not get past quality control. Funnily enough, actually using the holes, the random holes in the front that aren't there for the screws, actually would work perfectly. They're the perfect size for fan screws. So I don't know how the hell that got past quality control or design or anything. That should be fixed. This is Cooler Master. This isn't exactly a first company case, so they should have that stuff on point by now. But here's something I found that's quite annoying. Now, because the fans are intakes, generally fans are on intake will have the frame behind the blades, and then the blades will be pushing air through past the frame. So you have the blades here and the frame with the spokes holding the fan, so that when it blows, it comes away from the frame and then hovers rather than pressing into the frame as if it was the fan was the other way around pushing. You know what I mean? The frame the other way around. So, because of that situation, when you press against the case, like now, it's not a problem. Well, not because of that situation, because they're so slow. When you press against the frame, that's not a problem. But let's just say your fans decide to, I don't know, ramp up to quite a high speed because, I don't know, you're playing a pretty demanding game and you want to, you know, push your system to its limits. Now, when the fans start to kick up speed, they were actually not running at all then, hence why there was no problem. But the fan's kicking up speeds. This is going 1500 RPM, and it's going to go up to 2000 RPM, but even at lower RPMs, this is a problem. Now listen to this if you can hear this. Very lightly pressing. Very lightly pressing. That's because there's no clearance designed in the front of the chassis for fans when they spin up to get that tolerance that they require. Very lightly pressing. Now I'm just gingerly pressing my hands against here, and that's the fan blade scraping against the front of the chassis very lightly. Now if you're playing games and your case is perhaps underneath your desk, then this could become a problem. Or if you have it on your desk and you accidentally nudge it, if you hit that too hard, you might catch the fan on one of those circles and it'll snap the fan blade and send shards of your fan blade into your case. And that has happened to me on another case with a 140mm fan. Now also, if you have a fan with slightly more tolerance built into its design for the fan to come away from the frame a little more as part of its design, you're going to be hitting problems here. Now let's not get defensive about Cooler Master cases. They don't get everything right, and clearly this is poor quality control. This should have been designed out. Now the top one doesn't have this problem, mind you, because it's the other way around, so it's not going to have that problem, and the rear doesn't have that problem either. It's because the fan is on, the frame of the fan is on top, and the fan is exhausting, so it's hanging down, and it will be hanging down further when it kicks up speed. So the top doesn't have a problem at all, but this, unacceptable really. Anyway, let's get on with some full speed, maximum fan thermal testing. So I don't normally do this style of testing, but we're coming up to the final minute of testing on this cooler, so 1 minute left. It is going very strangely. Now, I want to have this on camera just in case it dies. I don't think it's going to die because the CPU clock will have to go to, I think, below 1.8 GHz before it decides to call it quits. At the moment, it's dropped down to 2.8 GHz, or 2806 MHz, so that is very low. It's the lowest I've ever seen it. Now, obviously, this is gonna present to you that Cooler Master doesn't exactly expect you to just leave its 1000 RPM included fan in there and have that as it is. And normally I would have thought you'd be putting a much larger CPU cooler in than the L9i that we have in this situation. The only reason we're using the L9i is because if we want to go with some really low profile MATX cases in the future, then we want maximum compatibility. So that's what I'm giving us the opportunity here, so we can compare the MITX cases and the ITX cases, MITX, ITX, same sort of thing, all the way up to the EATX cases in theory, or just random custom cases. So that's it, we have our testing. Let me pause everything now. So there we go, everything's paused. Now, you're going to see the graphs properly afterwards, but we see down here 2.7 GHz. Now I'm not going to show you actual footage, you just take my word for it. 2.7 GHz. It was pinned at 100 degrees after about the first minute. The small increase there. Really bad thermal. So clearly adding fans is going to be the key to cooling in this case. obviously, but it's always nice to know that is what is given to you enough to cool you know, your CPU and that sort of thing. Now, in a couple of the other cases, the Riotoros CR280, it was enough. Here it's not. So if you're going to be getting this case, get a couple of fans, at least a couple in the front. I just spat the camera, I'm very sorry. At least a couple at the front, maybe swap out that rear fan, maybe move the rear fan, just something more than what you've got. Or take these panels off, but you know, nobody's going to take those panels off. They come there for a reason. Doesn't look great without them, but I mean, that's subjective. That might be your thing. Anyway, that's pretty much that. I'm going to crack on with all the other tests, and we will look at the smattering afterwards, but I just wanted to bring this to you hot off the press. So let's get into the actual details of these tests. First things first, all the temperatures you're about to see in all of the graphs are delta T metrics, which simply means I've taken the temperature of the component and subtracted the ambient temperature of the room during each test. This simply means we can directly compare thermal results from each case for each test. Also good to know is that all tests are performed with all fans at full speed, so that's CPU, GPU, and all case fans. So we remove the variable of fan curves from the results. Just to clarify, the As It Comes test system has the only case fan being the included 1000 RPM 120mm fan to the rear, and the max fan graphs has 2 front and 1 rear, as well as 1 top rear 2200 RPM 120mm EK F4120 ER fan. And finally, before we kick off with all the results, all graphs are represented in order of case size from left to right, which is represented in litres by the purple bar. And the set of bars to the left represents the test bench, which you can see as a best case cooling solution for the test system. So starting with the Prime 95 and Thermark 10-minute torture test, which is thermally the most demanding test we're performing on the test system, the blue bar represents CPU temperature and the green bar represents GPU temperature. You'll notice that the CR280 and the Q300L have the blue CPU temperature bars fading to red. This is because they both hit 100 degrees centigrade during the test, but what is good to see is that the Q300L graphics card temperature falls somewhere in the middle of the Mastercase Pro 3 and the CR280, which is exactly where you'd expect it to be, considering the sizes of the cases. So what happens when we add all those fans? Well, the graphics card temperature drops, but the CPU still thermal throttles, hitting 100 degrees C. Now granted, we are using a very low profile CPU cooler, but Cooler Master have clearly been able to handle this system before, so let's check out how bad the clocks were. With the As It Comes setup, the clock speed dropped at its lowest point to 2.61 GHz, which is just abominable, and the GPU's clock speed dropped by a predictable amount, which is not too bad. But as I mentioned earlier, the likelihood is that you're bound to throw in more fans, so how does it fare with 4 high-speed fans? Well, it's fair to say quite a lot better, but this is still performing considerably worse than the CR280, a case a third smaller than the Q300L. So let's turn the gas down and check out a graphics-based synthetic benchmark, Unigine Superposition. The As It Comes test system performed worse here than both the bigger and smaller cases to the left and right, at least for the CPU. The GPU is falling right between the larger and smaller case, where you would expect it. However, it didn't get hot enough to affect the benchmark's performance though, so at least there's that. Adding fans to the system dropped the thermals, but it all still falls in line with the As It Comes test result. Now onto some gaming benchmarks. The GPU seemed to cope well with Dirt Showdown, which is the lightest loadout of all these tests, but the CPU is substantially hotter than the other results around. Adding fans helps but doesn't improve over the smaller CR280. Rise of the Tomb Raider gives us more of the same. The CPU just isn't being cooled as well as it was in the CR280. And again, adding fans helps, but a hotter CPU is a trend this case just can't kick. Hitman is where things take a turn for the worst. We're looking at a nearly 15 degrees C increase in CPU temperature over the CR280, but the GPU seems to be just about cooler. This is a game that really seems to benefit with more fans. Where the CR280 sees marginal differences, the Mastercase Pro 3 sees a 5 degrees reduction in CPU temps, and the Q300L sees 8 degrees knocked off its temps. And this is just from a 2-minute benchmark, so expect to see far more extravagant differences from a couple of hours of Hitman gameplay. And finally, GTA 5 seems to replicate the sentiment of the Hitman benchmark. The CPU seems to be in a world of its own, but adding fans certainly helps. However, it's still a hot, or at least a hotter potato than the other cases around. So there we have it, the full review complete of the Masterbox Q300L by Cooler Master. So I've got a few lists I've made here, some missed opportunities, some pros and some cons, but as to just touch on the length of the video, it is nice to be able to sometimes just very lightly touch on lots of bits of a case but not go into too much depth. That's nice to create. It's easier to create, but it doesn't give you the most information you could possibly get out of a case, and having links in the video description to me I think is very useful tool for you to be able to find the bits you want and not get too bored with having to wait through the entire video. So I hope we've sort of met a compromise on that note. So let's start off with the pros. Cable management is just a dream in this case. I found it so easy to route all the cables to their various positions. I didn't have to worry too much about having lots of straps to hold it against the case, the rear of the motherboard tray, so that was really nice to have. I just found it very naturally easy to build in. So if you're a beginner and you were looking at this case as a budget case, just to start off your PC building career or hobby, then I would certainly recommend this case. It's such a great place to start. And I gotta say, with all the issues with this Windows side panel, it actually looks great, and I think it's a fantastic looking system. The lighting doesn't work so well. It really doesn't. You just pick up way too much of the front panel, of the chassis itself, the pattern in the chassis, not the mesh at the front, which is what you really want. You haven't really seen much of that yet, but you'll see it after this conclusion piece. But yes, so that's, you know, it's good. The Windows side panel is good, but we will probably be having a tempered glass version in the future, so hold your breath on that one, probably. Not literally, but it will probably be coming quite soon. Also, the 2.5-inch drive mounts I find is just an absolute pro. They are just so simple, and they just look so elegant. You don't have a large bracket holding them in position. It doesn't take a lot of resources, materials, it doesn't take a lot of design, really, to put them into position in terms of, you know, location, not necessarily the mechanism themselves. Going on to cons then, the side panel retention mechanism, that is really pretty bad. In its standard location, it's just pretty awful all round, and this tab at the top really doesn't do a lot to help the situation. You're probably, you know, just as better off holding it with just outside of that tab at the top. So yeah, it's a bit of a con in my opinion. The front fan mounting clearance, there could have been a recessed panel, a punch-in segment just so you don't, or punch-out segment just so you don't have those issues with clearance. Even a couple of millimeter punch-out that would be accommodated for with the thickness of the magnetic strip. That would have been great to see, but they didn't do that, so you do have, they're not spinning now, but you do have issues if you were to knock it, and yes, you could break a fan that way, even though it seems so far-fetched. Next I have on my list is poor under lighting. I mentioned that before. The lighting isn't so great. If we turn it up now, I've got the remote in my pocket. If we hit the lighting up now, then potentially you'll see that there is an issue. There's bleed through the front, and you do see the pattern more, especially when you have brighter colours being thrown in. So yeah, green's quite nice, we'll leave it there. So yes, and then poor ventilation. I find it hilarious that Cooler Master pushes excellent ventilation, all that sort of stuff. Just because it's a mesh panel doesn't mean it's good ventilation. Like I said, over half of that front panel is just solid steel, and I say solid steel in the fact that you can't put your finger through it, so it's solid. So it is solid and it is steel, and then adding a mesh to that is only compounding that problem. So the only way you're really going to get great ventilation is by having a thinner or less dense filter like the Mastercase Pro 3. I reckon if this case had similar ventilation to the Mastercase Pro 3, we wouldn't be seeing the problems that we had. And it's basically exactly the identical system that we used. Actually, it is the identical system. The same motherboard, the same power supply unit, graphics card, RAM, everything. So there's not really many excuses. You can't say excellent ventilation. You cannot say excellent ventilation when something that can be cooled with also excellent ventilation cools better. It's not in the same league. So yeah, missed opportunities. Dave, I think that mounting sort of screw retention mechanism. Could have had with a slit, could have had a slit cut into the screw hole for that retention screw. That means you could unscrew it, pull it back, put the screw back in to hold it in position, and then install the graphics card. Just a missed opportunity though. The side panel window falls if it's not supported, unless it's in this orientation, so that's a missed opportunity. They could put a little bit more effort into making some sort of mechanism to stop it from falling, some sort of support permanently at the back here and the front, just to make sure it doesn't fall. The hard disk drive mounting plate, just a couple of holes in there and some screws, that would have sorted that out completely. The I/O positioning of the front I/O position blank plate, you could have had an inclusion of a blank plate like I mentioned, so that when you're swapping between the solid panel and the windowed panel, there wouldn't be an issue with swapping those. And then additional mesh sheets for horizontal options. So if you want to lay this case down horizontally, so flat, then you don't have another one of these sheets and you can't buy them. I'm not saying that it should be included as standard with the case, but I'm saying you should, for even £5, be able to buy one, and that £5 is a bit of a rip-off as far as that goes, because they're mass manufactured, mass produced. But yeah, even £5 though, you could just get another one. It would clean off the build perfectly, and there wouldn't be an issue there. So that is pretty much all I have. In terms of thermal performance, good enough is what I'm going to say. During editing, I didn't see any thermal throttling issues at all. Due to the reactionary nature of a fan curve, I did see the CPU hit 80 degrees or so during editing, but that's when there's huge dumps of the memory being performed every now and then. So, funnily enough, the 24 gigs of RAM I have in the system is just about enough. I regularly hit 21 gigs of RAM during editing, during big builds up and then memory dumps here and there into what I can imagine is the scratch disk. Yeah, that's it. I completely forgot what it was called. But yeah, memory dumps into the scratch disk is where the CPU really hits its stride. But I don't see any thermal throttling, even with an L9i with a 6700K. I don't think you're going to see problems, to be honest, playing games, unless you're really pushing a CPU-intensive game, or you're pushing a moderately CPU-intensive game for a period of, you know, I don't know, 3 hours or something. Enough time for it to really hit its equilibrium. You might see some thermal throttling. But yeah, that's pretty much all I've got. Closing the book on that now. So, if this makes a noise, I'm sorry. So thank you very much for checking this video out. If you want to support this channel, then you can, for a start, do likes or dislikes of the video. Subscribe to see more like this. I do intend to make these videos far shorter, but there's just so many different things to cover on this case. It wasn't so simple. If you want to support the channel even further, then you can go to Patreon and put some sort of donation. $1 a month would be fantastic, and we can, you know, be a bit more extravagant with the things we get, a little bit more out there in terms of what we review and how we review them. And you can always find the links to Amazon or affiliate links to Amazon to purchase this case in your respective region. I generally put them for about 7 different countries, so you'll likely find yours, whether it's in Europe, Canada, America, UK. So yes. And that pretty much finishes it off. So thank you very much for watching this video. Stick around for some B-roll segment with this being lighting, horizontal, vertical, and that sort of stuff in a second. And I will catch you in the next one, which will likely be the Silverstone RVZ03 Raven. See you guys.